So our final speaker of this session is Orla Fitzpatrick, who is the head librarian at the National Museum of Ireland. She recently completed a PhD as well on the subject of Irish photographic publications and modernity at Ulster University. And she'll be speaking to us about photographs of the Belfast Blitz.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here talking about Britishness. The photo book Bombs on Belfast portrays the aftermath of the Belfast Blitz of April and May 1941, revealing the impact of modern warfare and aerial bombardment upon an urban environment. Published by the Belfast Telegraph newspaper, this photographic book was produced during a period of official government control and wartime propaganda. This paper will demonstrate how photographs of urban ruins were also used to convey notions of Britishness. So I'll get the complicated bit over first of all. Before I do this, it's necessary to outline the political situation upon the island of Ireland. Following an uprising against British rule in 1916, a war of independence and then a civil war, the partition of Ireland occurred in 1920. The mainly Protestant Unionist six-county state of Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom, while the 26-county Irish Free State formed an independent jurisdiction. Northern Ireland retained a significant Catholic minority whose allegiances were not necessarily to Britain. During the Second World War, Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, was involved in the British war effort, whilst the Free State remained neutral. Bombs on Belfast was engraved, printed and published in 1942, the year following the Belfast Blitz, so it's made during the war. It reproduced 144 photographs over 54 pages, and these images are credited to the Belfast Telegraph. The newspaper's political and editorial stance was conservative and unionist. In keeping with wartime shortages, the quality of the paper is poor and the images are reproduced using half-tone printing. For the most part, the photographs depict bombed streetscapes immediately after the air raids or cleared sites in the weeks and months following the Blitz. Individual photographers are not named in Bombs on Belfast, though the dramatic nighttime scenes that you can see here were later identified as the work of John Bonner Holmes, a staff photographer with the newspaper, so his images were generally published without a credit. Britain, and especially London, underwent a period of sustained and strategic bombing between September 1940 and May 1941. It was felt that Northern Ireland, although an important centre for war production, was not a prime target for German bombers due to its geographic location. With the fall of the French government in 1940, German bombers could now reach Belfast from airports in northwestern France. The government were ineffectual and realised only too late that the state's increased role in the war effort left it vulnerable to attack. Too few shelters, poor early warning systems, inadequate anti-aircraft defences, and the absence of searchlights meant that the population of Belfast was, according to the Ministry of Public Security, less well defended than any comparable city or port in the United Kingdom. Belfast experienced its first raids on the 7th and 8th of April, during which 13 people died. This raid targeted the docks and nearby residential areas. It was followed by a more serious raid which took place on the 9th of the 15th of April 1951. This time the civilian casualties were much higher, with 900 fatalities and 1,500 serious injuries. Another high casualty raid occurred on the 9th of Sunday, the 4th of May 1941. The raids resulted in spectacular changes to the streetscapes of Belfast, and it is the manner in which these were recorded within Bombs on Belfast that I will explore today. Before I look at that, though, I'm going to examine the photographic portrayal of the Belfast Blitz. It is necessary to outline the concept of total war as envisaged by government, military and media in the decades preceding the Second World War. Overy, in his comprehensive work on the aerial bombardment of Europe, describes the concept, and I quote, "The belief that modern industrialised war was now fought between whole societies, each mobilising the material energies and willpower of their entire population for the task of fighting, arming and supplying the mass armed forces of the modern age. Whilst it was generally understood by the air forces themselves that bombing enemy populations for the sake of exerting terror was contrary to conventional rules of engagement, attack and killing of armament workers, destroying port facilities, or even burning down crops could all be construed without much sophistry as legitimate objectives of total war. It was within this framework of these ideas that the depictions of the Belfast Blitz were produced and received. Of course, local nuances, such as the sectarian divisions that existed within the city, influenced how the Blitz propaganda was received. Cartoons of barrage balloons and bombers are interspersed between the photographs in Bombs on Belfast. These jaunty illustrations are somewhat incongruous given the devastation, destruction, and death associated with the event. Barrage balloons were used to defend against aerial attack as they prevented dive bombing by forcing planes to fly at higher altitudes. Ironically, the Belfast civil defence did not have sufficient numbers of them in the months preceding the April attacks. Therefore, the photographic publication's use of barrage balloons reinforces the official line that the city was adequately protected against aerial bombardment. 7 pages featuring 24 photographs of churches are included within the publication. This concentration upon places of worship is similar to the portrayal of Blitz London, although the Belfast churches were not of the same architectural merit as, for example, the churches by Wren that featured in Cecil Beaton's book, History Under Fire. Photographs of St. Paul's Cathedral, undamaged amidst the ruins, were used as a symbol of London's resilience. In particular, Herbert Mason's iconic image of its dome rising amid the burning city came to embody the Blitz spirit. As censorship and government regulations prevented the depiction of dead or wounded civilians, this emphasis upon cultural icons is understandable. No one building was given preference nor attained iconic status within the portrayals of Belfast, although newspaper stories did focus upon the survival of certain churches. An intermingling of faith and allegiance to Britain is portrayed in this photograph, showing a Union flag flying from the rubble outside the MacRory Memorial Presbyterian Church. The Union flag is the national flag of the United Kingdom, and it represents the 1801 Union of Britain and Ireland. It continues to be an integral signifier of Unionist identity and a contentious symbol to this day of British imperialism for certain groups in Ireland. The Union flag also features in the photograph of the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester inspecting damage in Percy Street. The couple are photographed walking along dignitaries and members of the armed force amid the rubble, with a large Union flag being carried by one of the group. This is, of course, in keeping with the political allegiance and editorial policies of the newspaper, and is reiterated in the introduction to Bombs on Belfast, which refers to Ulster paying the price, and I quote, of its loyalty to the British Empire. The editorial narrative which accompanies these images does not allow for any deviation from what Calder calls the myth of the Blitz. Morale is always high, the civil defence do an excellent job, and there are no mentions of death, casualties, looting, or civil disobedience. It is only through the accounts provided by alternative sources, such as those by the Mass Observation Project, that we encounter a narrative which runs counter to the official line. The following diary entry, written by Mayo Woodside, reveals a distrust of the newspaper reporting and indicates the real feeling on the streets of Belfast. And I quote, "Press reports of the raid are nauseating. Of course, they are hampered by not being allowed to mention any street or building by name. But even so, it should not be necessary to turn out all the usual journalistic cliches and claptrap about stricken mothers, citizens' courage, stoicism, traitors carried on with a smile, etc., etc. The truth is that people are dazed, worn out, many despairing, nerves and irritability everywhere." These observations on Northern Irish media coverage are very much in keeping with Calder's theories surrounding the myth of the Blitz. His discourse maintains that the official narrative, constructed during and after the bombing raids on Britain, did not fully recognise the suffering and resentment of bomb victims. Instead, the government and media, which includes motion pictures and books such as Bombs on Belfast, conspired to maintain public morale through the account which portrays the bombed civilians as uniformly accepting of hardships and able to continue on with their lives. Initially, this myth was focused on the reaction of Londoners, with particular attention drawn towards the cheerful Cockney, carrying on as normal despite the destruction of his home and neighbourhood. In turn, this example was used and internalised by the public as a template for how other cities should behave in the aftermath of aerial bombardment. Within Bombs on Belfast, photographs such as this group of cheerful troops gathered around a church organ on a bombed street are indicative of the imagery which perpetuated and exemplified the Blitz spirit. The caption reads, "Musical interlude, an impromptu organ recital in York Road," and York Road was one of the streets that was most badly damaged. This is a narrative which does not allow for any dissenting voices or for the trauma experienced by those who lost homes and families. The voices of conscientious objectors, pacifists, and those who did not agree with the government policies were silenced. Within the Northern Ireland context, as observed by Woodside above, the bombing resulted in anxiety and often despair amongst the general population. Northern Ireland's labour unrest, which manifested itself in many strikes during the period, and the anger at inadequate defence measures are signifiers that the simplistic notions positive within the myth were not necessarily reflective of opinions on the street. Much of the rhetoric surrounding the Blitz refers to the notion of rebuilding. Even in the midst of war, with no end to the conflict in sight, planners and politicians referred to the societal changes that would take place after the conflict. In this respect, Bombs on Belfast is no different to the official and journalistic pieces which either hint or refer overtly to post-war planning and improvements in other bombed cities, both in Britain and Germany. Donald Gibson, Coventry's chief architect, declared, and I quote, "The Blitz was an architect's dream," and his language is typical of that used by many planners and architects to describe the opportunities that the bombing provided. The concept of changed vistas and spaces opening up to provide a blank canvas for new and better homes and city centres is also referenced within Bombs on Belfast. The short introduction to the book concludes with the following text, which closely echoes the voice of planners in London and other bombed cities. One bright gleam emerges even from the scene so depressing, as never before architectural merit has opportunity to come into its own. With gardens and open spaces as garments of beauty, there may arise a new Belfast with an interior worthy of the unrivalled setting with which nature has endowed the city on the Lagan. These new vistas are referred to throughout Bombs on Belfast. These photographs do not show the immediate aftermath of bombing and instead show cleared and tidied scenes, mainly viewed from above. Eliminated from the book's narrative is the fact that these transformations were enabled by the death of Belfast people and the destruction of streets, which, although often of a poor standard, were homes and parts of communities. The tone used by the newspaper in its 1942 publication, with its focus upon structural damage, was noted by a reviewer of a later reissue as follows: "There was something incredibly heartless in the Belfast Telegraph's approach, its focus on property, with people getting hardly a mention." Some pages depict the same location in three different ways, showing firstly a street before bombing, followed by the same location in post-bombing ruin, and finally the site clearance. The middle image attempts to portray an absence and encourages comparison with the pre-conflict landscape. This is a recognised phenomenon amongst ruin photography, as noticed by Simon Baker, who, in reference to depictions of First World War sites, notes that often the photographer, and I quote, "has arrived to find merely the place where something used to be, evidence only of absence." In Bombs on Belfast, the final images of the cleared site are sometimes captioned with a text emphasising future developments, and this could be viewed as an attempt to form a coherent narrative from the chaos of war and to echo cycles of destruction and rebirth. Of course, Bombs on Belfast was not the only photographic portrayal of Northern Ireland during the period. Mass-market photo magazines such as Picture Post were widely read in both the north and south of Ireland. During the course of the war, the journal featured several articles on Ireland, causing it to be lauded in the northern state and banned for a period in the Free State. The Picture Post, which was in the style of My Life magazine, was liberal, anti-fascist and populist, and its banning shows the power of these images. Bombs on Belfast provides a powerful photographic depiction of the impact of the aerial bombardment of the city. The Belfast Telegraph, with its unionist leanings, spun the Blitz into a narrative that consolidated and sought to celebrate the state's position within the United Kingdom and its links to Britain. The timing of the publication, which did not appear until the year following the Blitz, is evidence of modern state censorship and control. Northern Ireland's sectarian divisions and other characteristics of the state made it, according to Calder, and I quote, hardest of all provincial blitzes to mythologise adequately. Thank you.
Thank you for such a wonderful paper. I wanted to ask you more about the destruction and reconstruction of the city, especially thinking about, did the city take on any aspect of the graveyard, in the sense were certain buildings, certain destroyed buildings, maintained as destroyed in order to become memorials, or was there an aspect of memorialization in this destruction and reconstruction?
Unlike Coventry and other cities, nothing was kept, and I think the plans for reconstruction were quite elaborate, and they started planning during the war, but they didn't really happen until the 1960s. There was a time delay, and then the sectarian divisions post-war meant that new towns were a little longer being created. But there is no site of pilgrimage per se, but there would be more war memorials than in the south. So nothing was retained, and that sort of as a reminder.